right.
Retribution from the Jews, he would back out and say, "Oh, yeah, I'm like you."
Yeah.
That's the hypocrisy.
Yeah, he was very clearly changing his behavior because of people and not because of the gospel. I think that's the big thing we're intended to see. Because, like Stuart said, he knew what the gospel was. He even practiced the gospel. He even still believed the gospel. I want you to notice a very important detail that we see here in Galatians is that as Paul is opposing Peter to his face, their belief systems hadn't changed. In fact, their belief systems were still in alignment with one another. They still agreed with one another about what the gospel said. And I think this is especially important to note of Peter because, again, as Stuart mentioned, he was very aware that God was allowing the Gentiles in. God had personally revealed this to him in Acts chapter 10. You remember the vision of the sheep and the clean and the unclean animals? And just prior to this, Paul has just recounted this event where Paul and Barnabas and Titus, a Greek, had come to Jerusalem, and Peter was associating with them. He was spending time with them. He had declared himself. He publicly acknowledged that circumcision, the law, they weren't necessary. So Peter knew all of these things. His belief in these hadn't changed. And furthermore, kind of to George's point, Peter had applied the gospel to his own life. We're intended to see this. He had allowed himself liberty from the law and liberty from its constraints. I think that's what Paul means in chapter 2 and verse 14 at the end where he says, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? What is he accusing? This is question number 2. What is Paul accusing Peter of doing here at the end of verse number 14? Here's some rumblings here. Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
I just wrote down, he's not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You think about what he's saying here. So he's saying you're a Jew, right? But you're living like a Gentile. You have released yourself from the law. You've released yourself from those things previously. And so you're okay with that. You're not living like a Jew. And yet here you are turning around and you're looking at the Gentiles and you're saying, well, you need to live this certain way. You need to be bound by the law. That Peter wasn't even applying to himself. You see, he was willing to accept that because it was great for him, right? He was eating with them before. Presumably, he was eating foods that were once restricted. You think about that vision in Acts 10. I suspect Peter was doing some of that, probably gladly cast those things aside. He had applied the truth of the gospel to himself, but he had a different standard for the Gentiles. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, he was interesting. He was a hypocrite in public, and Paul stood to the face because he was condemned. First of all, he had powers, right?
Yes.
Unusual powers.
Yes.
He was wrong in what he did, not because he didn't know the truth, because he didn't practice it, because he's a hypocrite. And I don't know who knows why he was doing it. He might have been just trying to pacify the Jews, wanted to be able to teach them. He might have had real good reasons why he was
sure.
Right? We always do. But I think it's interesting that he says he stood condemned. He stood lost and wrong. And a lot of times you would just take somebody to the side and say you're wrong. But the problem was he was hypocrite in front of people.
That's right.
And he stood to his face because he needed it, because he was wrong. And we could argue about all the old law and all that, but this is a state of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And it was public, and he made the rebuke public.
Yeah.
Is there anything in there for us at all?
Yeah, I want to get to that in just a second. I think it's important what you said to bring up, though. Peter knew. He knew what he was doing. It was very clear, and it was because of the nature of how he was behaving. It was in a public way, and it needed to be addressed in that public way. I want to get to some application here in just a second, but that's, I think, such an important point to make. Go ahead.
Well, and he was a leader in the church, right? So, this is a significant thing that's happening here because the gospel unites people, or it's supposed to. And what we're seeing here is men were dividing not over the gospel belief or unbelief. They were dividing over their own ideas or cultural preferences, right? Like some of that stuff was, like if they really believed in the old law, they would all be Christians and they would be embracing one another in Christ. But they're really stuck in kind of their cultural patterns that they're used to and comfortable with, and now they're dividing over it. That's out of step with the gospel.
Yeah, going back to Jim's point, they probably had really good reasons for why they behaved this way. And I think this is important for us to see because from our view, we can see who's right and wrong here. We can see that. But you put yourself in their shoes. Here are people who were God's people. They were Jews for generations. They weren't allowed to do these things. I mean, trying to break away from that had to be complicated, had to be difficult, had to not feel right. I mean, can you imagine Peter, when God came to Peter and said, hey, rise, Peter, kill me? He said, no way. You know, I've never done that, Lord. And here's God himself appearing to him. So you can imagine the struggle and the comfort of, that was the argument that most of the religious leaders had. We know this is from God because God spoke to Moses. We are confident in this. That was a substantial place for them to stand that gave them comfort. And we need to be cautious about that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we start applying this. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, just thinking about it. So it's a uniter to those who believe it and practice it. In fact, he talks about over time, if you don't agree, over time we're going to agree. But Jesus didn't come to unite people. He said, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. We will have division in families. And in fact, it would be the closest of your families that you have division in. So you just think about the difficulty that would be to confront Peter is the rock, dude. Right? But he wasn't going to let for your heart. The reason you're where you're at is because sometimes the gospel cut you to pieces, right?
That's right.
And here we have it does. And we should be that kind of people too, right?
And it ought to bring a certain humility in the way that we behave and the way we treat one another.
That's the distinction that I make, is dividing over belief or unbelief in the gospel versus dividing over man's ideas, opinions,
constructs,
etc.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you that's a very obvious point of application that we need to talk about, but we've got to be very, very careful when we start talking about that, because when you start dealing with people's convictions, I think that's what a passage like Romans 14 is about, to try to help us understand. There's nothing wrong with having convictions that differ, but you have to treat those very, very carefully. All right, I got a lot of hands here. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, so did I hear earlier that we were suggesting that Peter was actually teaching the Gentiles that they had to be circumcised and keep the law in this case?
I don't know. I don't think I said that, but
okay, I just missed
if I did, I didn't intend to say that.
Okay, all right, I just misunderstood.
Okay.
That's all I have.
Okay, Linda.
I think Jim touched on this earlier, rebuking him in public.
Sure.
It wasn't just for Peter, it was for
That's
the
right.
Gentiles to see, hey, even he can be wrong sometimes in
That's
his
right.
behavior. Not in his message, but his behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important that Paul saw this conduct. This wasn't hearsay, this wasn't conjecture. He saw it in this context, and it needed to be addressed in such a way. And so Paul confronts him publicly. He talks about how he did this before all of them. And Paul had no issues with other people being present, because that's the way it needed to be, because of who was involved in it. As we've already mentioned, Peter was a man of influence. That's important to see. He was a man of influence. And that's an obvious point, but what's interesting to me, Paul seems to minimize that and say, the bigger issue was that Peter stood condemned. I think you said that earlier. He stood condemned. That's the same word used in chapter 1 and verse number 8, the anathema. That's the same word he used of Peter. He said he stood condemned, accursed, because the way that he is behaving is literally severing him from Christ. It's going a different direction. That's why this is so serious, and why Paul was so willing to say, look, Peter, you got this wrong. And if you keep going like this, you are going to be separated from Christ. You can't have Christ in the law. You just can't have both. You can't. Danny, did you have a hand?
It also seems that Peter loved the praise of men.
Sure.
The praise of God.
Don't we all, though, man?
Peter's in here. I feel his pain. I mean, I'm so proud of Peter's in here. Because you look at me and you look like a person like, that's not Peter. But you look at a person that struggles doing the right thing, and I know the right thing to do, and I still struggle. There's all kinds of issues and pressure. It's my goodness. Thank God for Peter, really.
And the people that Peter was influenced by, these were his countrymen. These were people he had grown up with. This was there was a lot of serious pressures here, and I think we feel those pressures too, right? The people that we go to church with, the people we grew up, family. That's right. We are pressured to see the gospel, to hear things, to read things through a very specific construct and think a certain way. right? And we have to be very cautious about that. I'm not saying that those things aren't valuable. In fact, in other places, Paul would talk about the importance of traditions, right, and that structure in our life. But at the same time, we need to be very cautious. I think that this, again, I'm glad Peter's in here too, because the fact that Peter could be influenced and impacted by somebody, I mean, we're all susceptible to this. Okay, I got Linda, Michael, Stewart.
I think this is a wonderful object lesson for all of us in that we cannot let our culture separate us from the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's exactly what Peter did.
Yeah.
I mean, not to dog Peter so hard,
We're
but
doing it. No.
he let his Jewish culture separate him from the gospel, and that's you don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah, he was more comfortable making his fellow Jews happy than stepping out and doing what the gospel said.
I'm sure he was very torn, though.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think about what this situation would have looked like, because he had to make some choices here about who his friends were. Because, think about it. Beforehand, here are these Gentiles, and here's Peter spending time with them, and all of a sudden he's not. I mean, he had to make a choice about those relationships and who he was going to make happy. And I guess you always kind of have to make those choices. It seems, Paul was making those choices, because calling Peter out, he had to make some choices too, but it was rooted in the gospel and not rooted in these people. Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
We're already kind of, we've already been hitting on it. There's like multiple things that we can extract from this little bit of verse. One of the things from like Peter's perspective, like we don't really, we think of Jew, we have like this modern context of Jew,
Sure.
And like what that entailed. And that's completely different than like what was here. So like, I could sit there and I could be ostracized from this church, and I can still function perfectly fine in society.
Sure.
Meaning, I can enact business, I can conduct business, I can feed my family, and so forth. In this, if you're kicked out of the temple in a theocracy that's been established for hundreds, thousands of years, you don't get to feed your family in that town. No one's doing business with you.
That's a good
You're
point.
going to have to go to Gentiles, or you're going to have to leave town. So I can, and then furthermore, you think about Peter and the hypocrisy, and it's the case in our lives too, right? We're always pulled in different directions here.
Sure.
And oftentimes we can justify these compromises that we make ourselves, but then at the same time, I think you need to give like a little bit of grace to folks. I mean, think about someone who's been one of the isms, however you want to define it, and had this issue for decades and decades and decades, and then 80 years old, and come to the Lord. Do you think that they're going to have the same understanding as someone who's raised up?
Sure.
They're not. Furthermore, someone who's raised up in the Word and steeped in traditions of man, are we going to have our our baggage that we bring and feel very convicted about?
Yeah.
I think we will.
That's a good point. And I think it's maybe that's part of the reason why you got Peter and Paul having this confrontation, because Paul understood Peter's issues and he was able to speak to him directly, saying, "I got it." And that's really what the end of the chapter is about. We are Jews by birth. We're not Gentile sinners. Look, we were born into this culture where we were God's special people. I got it. But that's not what the gospel is, and you're missing it. You've got to see the gospel as something different. Yeah, that's a great point. We have to offer a lot of grace. But there are moments where the Peter and Paul moments have to happen. We'll get to that in just a second. Go ahead, Stuart.
I'm going to bring up a point that hasn't been discussed yet, that this is an example of how to deal with sin.
Sure.
Because other passages talks about how we are to confess the sins as far as they are known. And in this case, everyone there is aware of what actually happened. And Paul is taking this not just for the Gentiles. This is also for those Jews that came down.
Sure.
So that they know, hey, he did this because for various reasons, but it was wrong. And you need to learn this lesson too, so that you will not propagate this problem in the future, because the gospel is for all. It's not just for Jews. It's not for those who are like Jews. It's for all, and they have to follow God. And the law of Moses is not Christianity.
Yeah.
And if by doing this in public, the Gentiles know, okay, they've wronged you. Of course, it's expected that Peter would have repented
Sure.
of this and said, I was wrong. But also those Jews there needed to see this, oh, Peter was called on the carpet. And he said, yes, I was wrong. Therefore, I need to make sure that I follow the example of not doing that. But he rejected the example that Peter did by going away from the Gentiles and accept the Gentiles, and eat with them and have fellowship with them, so that the Christianity will be, the body will be edified, because we love God.
Yeah.
We do God's will. And because we love God, we love our fellow men.
That's right.
And Paul talks about, how can you love a person, claim to love God when you hate your fellow man?
That's right.
And by them separating themselves from the Jews, from the Gentiles, they're saying, we don't love you. And therefore they're saying, Christ, we don't love you either. Yeah. Because you cannot show your love for Christ if you can't love right here now, because you can't see Christ.
That's right.
You aren't there with Christ. So if you're not showing that you care and love, then you're not showing God.
Yeah, the gospel is at play in the context of other people. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, I appreciate where you started. I was thinking about the passage that says, if your brother sins against you, go to your brother. That's the pattern we're given, and I think we see that very clearly. And what's interesting, and I think important for us to see, this interaction consists of 4 verses, right? But this interaction is what really kept the gospel moving forward in a unified way. Because Paul's actions with Peter, it kept, think about what the implications would have been if Paul had not withstood Peter to his face. Here's the path that they're on. At this point, there's now becoming a Gentile church and a Jewish church, right? And that path could have kept splitting, right? And it could have kept going, and this would have been Peter's church, and this would have been Paul's church. And some people continue to try to do that, right? And people today still continue to try. But that was the path that this was going. And Paul said, no, that's not how this goes. We are one body, one spirit. Isn't that what Ephesians 4 is about? There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. How can we say that if we're not all accepted on the same terms by God? That to me is the truth of the gospel. The truth of the gospel is that God accepts everyone on the same terms. By faith in Christ Jesus and obedience to Him. That's the truth of the gospel that everyone gets on board with. There's no distinction here. Did you have a comment?
No, well,
You did a while back.
This is after that's already happened.
Okay.
So I don't think he's talking about Peter so much as trying to show that he's the apostle.
Yeah.
And what he says is true. So I don't think he's, as you said, bad mouth to Peter.
Sure.
Still, after all of that, I think they're probably, that's already settled.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It is, wasn't it?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, because Peter stood condemned, he wanted everyone to be right with God. That's what the gospel brings us to.
And later on, of course, he mentions Paul in his writing. But, it's and if you've ever had to leave a church because they were doing something wrong or discuss it, you can kind of understand more how he felt.
The tensions, absolutely, yeah.
So this is right.
Yeah.
And what's right is right, what's not is not.
Daniel?
Just a general comment, and I keep going back to what someone said about just the influence of Peter. Well, when you expand that a little bit, we're dealing with 3 major players in the early church: Paul,
That's right.
Peter, and James. And I think this episode here has proved to be very formative in the influence and the teachings and writings, because you see it all through each of their writings. So just that point that was brought up really magnified. This was a kind of a pivotal moment in 4 verses that it's talked about here. So I think it's reflected in various other points in Scripture from these leading Christians.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because as I was thinking about, what does this section mean for us? How are we supposed to apply this? We need to first and foremost remember this was a very, very unique situation. And that you do have these two very influential people at a very fledgling state of the church, right? This needed to happen this way. It was unique. It was profound. Two inspired men with huge influence, right? They needed to have this confrontation. They needed to have this discussion. Because as I mentioned, the church could have gone two different ways if this didn't happen. And so I think that's important for us as we're thinking about it. You know, we're not Peter's and we're not Paul's, and we're not in the early part of the church, right? We have a lot more information than they do as well. You know, we have a lot more establishment in what the gospel looks like and what it looks like practically applied. And so I don't think that we just need to be cautious about approaching one another in the way that they approach one another. Now, that's not to say we just shouldn't have confrontation, but I think that that's an important note to say. So having said that, let me ask you this. What are some things we ought to learn from this episode? Maybe some applications that we can take. Mike, are you going in that direction, or do you want to say something before that?
To an extent. Yes, sort of. Yes.
If not, you don't have to say anything.
Exactly. So we have someone openly combating, doctrinal error. And so I guess the struggle in my mind is how far or what are the limits for us today when dealing with doctrinal error? Because I've often, I've heard justifications for, well, this group over there, that group, this person, or whatnot, and it's very public, very public. And in my mind, I don't think it's always going to be right. So I guess you kind of see like the application being like addressing doctrinal error. Because at the same time, Jesus, went into the temple and flipped tables, grabbed whips, and drove people out.
Sure.
When a little kid comes to sell candy bars in church, we don't do that to them. And that's not an apples-to-apples comparison. But basically, what limits or what constraints do we have, today? Because we're also talking; these were apostles.
Sure.
These guys were hand-selected.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that any of us would.
I'm going to let George take the first swing at that one.
Okay, I just wanted to say something about that too, because I think one thing it teaches us, there are circumstances in which, correcting someone publicly, if I can use it, correcting may not be the right word, but in this case, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but I think in most cases, it's not okay to do that. And we can't take this and just apply it across the board. Right. Especially, most of the time it's a situation where one brother's offended another, and that needs to be done privately. Right. And even in circumstances where somebody might say something from the pulpit or whatever, I think it's appropriate, nearly always, to go to that person privately and let him correct it, later. So, hey, I said this, and somebody's helped me say this is not right. And because I think the situation here is Peter knew what he was
That's right. I think that's the key point.
He knew what he was doing is wrong, and honestly, he should expect this from Paul, and because what he was doing was compelling sin in others, they needed to all see that this is not right.
That's right.
So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, that little leaven was leavening the whole lump, and it needed to be weeded out. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key point, though. I think Jim said it earlier. Peter knew what he was doing, and it needed to be addressed. When someone is a sleight of tongue or speaking out of ignorance, that's a very different circumstance. That's not what we're dealing with here. And especially when you start talking about doctrinal issues, if somebody is teaching something they know is wrong, then that's means for, I think, public address. But for the most part, oftentimes things get said that are not intentional. I don't say that as an excuse. That's how it happens. And that's why we're told to be very careful about the things we say. And I think about that as a preacher all the time. But for sure, go ahead.
Well, also, an influential person can influence others, like even Barnabas.
Even Barnabas.
So if you have great influence with your brother, I think you're more responsible for how you act.
Yeah, with great power comes great responsibility. That's a great point. Go ahead, Dennis.
Just adding to what George was saying, I think it all comes down to the condition of the heart. When things start happening and you start seeing things, And I do believe the first place to go is to an individual.
Go to your brother, that's right.
But then when it becomes apparent that this individual is teaching something that is not right, is teaching and doing it publicly, then you have to have the courage, you have to have the attitude to be able to stand forward and say, this is wrong. I think a lot of times we don't. It's very uncomfortable to have this confrontation, especially in public. But at times you have to have it, especially if it's something that is being taught and it's not being, there's not a misunderstanding anymore. It's like they're teaching error. You know, we have congregations that have taught error and been split because people have got up and said, this is not what the scriptures have said. And we have to have the fortitude to do that, but that's the last, that's the last step. That's not the first step. We always want to go to the last step as the first step, but that's not it.
That's right.
But when it does become apparent, you've got to have the courage, and you've got to have, of course, the scriptures to back up what you're saying, and be able to stand before people and say, this is not right.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that speaks to a very fundamental premise, and that is that fellowship requires accountability. We need to be accountable to one another. That's part of what our relationships are about. You know, and that's part of what we're doing here in this class is we're trying to work together in fellowship and in harmony and work through, you know, differences that we might have. But we have to have accountability, just fundamentally. I think something else that's important to see here is how damaging hypocrisy can be. Damaging to the church. You know, it alienated and divided people. And I was thinking about those Gentiles. It probably caused them to question and doubt their acceptance in Christ because of how Peter was treating them. It had nothing to do with Christ. The gospel hadn't changed. The people had changed. And so hypocrisy does terrible, terrible damage. It affects how those people view Christ, and intuitively, you know, people sense inconsistency even if they can't put their finger on it, right? They sense it. It affects our influence with non-believers. You know, that's one of the biggest complaints of non-believers, right? The church is just full of hypocrites, right? And we can't obviously deal with everyone, and that can't be used as an excuse, but its reality is harmful. You know, it's harmful for us and for the church. It damages our relationships with one another. You know, we're to speak the truth to one another in love. I wondered if Peter had to make up reasons for why he wouldn't hang out with those Gentiles, you know, what those conversations looked like. Obviously, those relationships were damaged. We need to remember that we are ambassadors for Christ, reconciling people to Him and showing others what that looks like by the way that we live our lives, not just with our words, but our actions. You see that? It was more Peter's actions than it was his words, because he preached the gospel. He didn't practice the gospel. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you may have said this and I just missed it, but that idea of people say, well, the church is full of hypocrites, that just goes to prove the point. How much hypocrisy does affect
That's right.
other people.
Yeah.
And I want to add to that, to say I'd rather spend Sundays with hypocrites than eternity in hell with the devil. That is not an appropriate response to that.
Never heard that one. I'm out.
We all are hypocrites at times. And somebody says that, I just say, one more won't hurt us, come on. You know, one more. I promise, there's not a soul in here that's not hypocrite sometimes. Not a soul in here that's above sin.
Sure.
Even sin that they know they shouldn't do. So
Yeah, that's a different.
Another 100 or 200 would not bother me, a hypocrite, because we all are struggling, all of us.
Well, and yeah, Peter shows us. You know, we have something. Influence is very powerful.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. Go ahead, Daniel. No.
Just going back to previous application point, maybe I'm splitting hairs and probably don't have any time to discuss this, but I'm not so sure the issue was really doctrinal as much as it was behavioral.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I don't really know how you could knowingly preach false doctrine like that. That doesn't make sense to me.
Sure.
Like, either know or you don't. And at that point, you're just being deceptive, and that's a conduct issue, which is exactly, says Paul said he saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth. So that
right.
was, I don't think this is really a doctrinal application. It's like maybe in effect you are teaching doctrine through your actions, but like it's clear, like given the people involved, this is more of a behavioral issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ken, I'll let you get the final thought here.
Okay, well, I was just gonna quickly say that, if you read through the New Testament about the early church, them coming together and breaking bread was a core part of their fellowship. And so, not eating with someone was a big deal.
Yeah.
I think in our culture today, we lose some of that. But two modern examples, an evangelist confronted an elder in the church because the elder expressed basically that he didn't fully feel comfortable or want a person there who was going through a lot of problems and had a rough life and needed a lot of help. And this elder publicly said that he wasn't sure if they really wanted people like that there. The evangelist confronted him publicly over that, because that was not a step with the gospel. And another similar example was when an eldership started him-hawing around accepting a black member into the church. And an evangelist publicly withstood the eldership over that, because that was out of step with the gospel.
Well, those are just not elder people to their elder, right? Those people should be elders.
All right, fellas and ladies, thank you for your comments this morning. I'm going to let George take the end of that chapter and get some momentum into chapter 3.
Yeah, start on.
Give you a little bit extra to work with. How about that?
Get the last word.